I raised 7 children on my own. 7 lives I carried with my hands, feeding them, guiding them, teaching them. Yet today, if I tell you the truth, not one of them calls me. Not one remembers to reach out. And that silence, that pain of giving my whole life only to be left behind, was what pushed me one evening to sit at my kitchen table, open an old notebook, and begin writing my story. But I didn't sign it as Samuel Carter. No, I used another name. To my surprise, that very book ended up in the hands of the children who had forgotten me, and they never knew it was their story. My name is Samuel Carter, but it was only through writing that I finally felt seen. I am a retired teacher. For over 30 years, I taught English to little ones in a small town called Pine Grove in Pennsylvania. I was married once, but my children's mother passed away far too soon, leaving me with every duty, raising them, teaching them, putting food on the table. I never once complained. In fact, I carried pride in it. I come from a time when men cried alone, but never let their children suffer, and still I was forgotten. Before I continue, I want to thank the Infidelity Tales Hub channel for letting me share my story, and I ask you, the listener, to support by subscribing and telling us in the comments which city you are watching from. Every day brings a new story, and maybe one will mirror your own. I was never a man for the spotlight. I lived simply in a wooden house near the train tracks. People in town knew me as Mr. Samuel, the teacher. My children grew one by one, all of them studying, achieving opportunities I never had as a boy. In my own childhood, I only made it to the 4th grade before working as a barber's helper to support my parents. I later finished my studies as an adult with children of my own. Still, I gave them more than I had, but time doesn't stop. Children grow, they leave, they build their own lives, and suddenly you wake up alone. I still remember my first Christmas by myself, the quiet house, the radio playing softly, me sitting at a table set for just one. It felt like a cruel trick, and it was on that night that I began to write. I never meant for anyone else to read it. No, those pages were only for me, to ease the heaviness I carried inside. I pulled out an old blue notebook from the back of a drawer and began to write. Once upon a time, there was a man who raised 7 children alone. With each line, I felt the burden on my chest grow lighter. The words flowed as if I was speaking to someone beside me, sharing the memories of good moments, hard days, and small joys no one else remembered. I wrote about nights like the one when my youngest son learned to read under the glow of a kerosene lamp before sunrise. I wrote and I wept, but I never stopped. For months I kept on, always in the early hours when loneliness felt sharpest. Then a thought came to me. What if I sent this to a publisher? It seemed foolish. Who would care about the story of an almost 80-year-old man, written by hand in a worn notebook? Still, I sent it with a note. This is the story of a father who raised 7 children alone and was forgotten. I didn't even use my real name. I signed it as David Rowan. To my shock, just 2 weeks later, I received a call. A young woman from a publishing house said my words had touched everyone there, and they wanted to make it a book. I was stunned. It felt unreal, yet it was happening. That's how it began. My book came out, signed only as David Rowan, my invented name. And then the strangest thing happened. This story began to travel across America. One day, the very children who never called me were sharing it online, saying, "This story is so beautiful, it feels like it could be about my father." And in that moment I understood. Sometimes to be heard, you must first remain silent. After the book came out, my life looked the same. A quiet house, coffee in the old percolator, me on the porch watching the birds and the empty street. But inside, something had shifted. A strange peace lived in me, because even if no one came to my door anymore, I knew my story was alive on paper, reaching others, stirring hearts. Still, there were days when loneliness returned so strongly it almost crushed me. All it took was one glance at the dusty photographs on the living room shelf, and a lump rose in my throat. There was a picture of all 7 children together, still young, all dressed in their school uniforms, white shirts, navy trousers, those innocent smiles of kids who had no idea what life had in store. And there I was, standing behind them with my hand resting on the shoulder of the eldest. I would stare at that photo and ask myself where I had failed. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, something unexpected happened. I was in the kitchen, sipping my coffee, when I heard my cell phone buzz on the table. Calls were so rare for me that my heart began to race. I picked it up, saw an unknown number, and hesitated before answering. On the line was a young woman's voice. She said she was a journalist from a well-known news site. She explained she was writing a piece on the sudden success of the book The Story of an Anonymous Father, the title they had given my work, and asked if I would grant her an interview. I froze, staying silent for a few seconds before whispering, "Miss, I think you must have the wrong person." But she pressed on. She explained they had received an anonymous tip claiming the real author was a retired teacher from Pine Grove and that someone in town had confirmed it. My heart nearly stopped. I had written only to heal myself, not to be recognized, not to make headlines. Yet in that moment I wondered, could it be God opening a door for me to finally be heard? I breathed deeply and told her, "I'll need some time to think." She agreed and promised to call back in a few days. I hung up and sat staring at the phone as though it was something unfamiliar, a device that almost never rang, now delivering such news. The rest of the day I stayed quiet, skipping my usual walk. I pulled out the blue notebook again from the drawer in my wardrobe. I opened to the first page and read the words. Once upon a time, there was a man who raised 7 children alone. The handwriting was shaky, uneven but honest. I turned the pages slowly, reliving each memory written there. Then a long-buried scene returned, the day my eldest son walked across the stage at his law school graduation. I had sacrificed everything to see him reach that stage. I sold the old car I once used to drive to school each day. I began taking the bus, carrying my books and papers under my arm, just so I could save every penny. Slowly, with each coin put aside, I bought the suit he wore for graduation. On the day of the ceremony, I stood in the crowd, watching with pride as he walked up on stage and received his diploma. But he never turned to look at me. He went straight into the arms of his girlfriend, then to his friends waiting in excitement. I remained in the back, hand deep in my pocket, waiting for him to notice me. At the end, he finally came near, gave me a quick hug, and said only 2 words, "Thanks, Dad." That was all. I never complained. Still, that day stayed carved into my heart. And now, as I read those same lines in my notebook, the memory came back with force. Life, I realized, is full of these quiet moments. Sometimes, what cuts deepest is not anger, not an insult, but silence. The silence of a child who should meet your eyes with pride but doesn't. The silence of a son who should call you on a Sunday but never does. With all that on my mind, the very next Monday when my phone rang again, I already knew what I would say. It was the journalist. I told her, "Miss, I accept, but I made one request. No pictures, no cameras, no video, only my voice. If I was going to speak, it would be like I always had, plain, calm, like a conversation over coffee in a quiet kitchen." She agreed. And so it happened. I gave the interview by phone, my words steady, telling my story without names, without places, keeping it simple. A few days later, the article was published, and the strange thing, people online began commenting. "This story sounds just like my father's," they said. And who was writing those words? My own children. At first, I just read in silence, keeping the truth to myself. But one early morning, staring at the glowing screen, I felt the urge to answer, to tell them it was me behind the story they admired. Yet I held back. I wasn't ready. Not yet. After that interview, I carried a strange feeling inside. Part of me believed I had done the right thing, speaking, even if no one knew my name. But another part carried doubt, the tightness in my chest, whispering that maybe I should have gone directly to my children. Still, I couldn't. I wasn't ready to open myself that way. So I returned to my routine. Early coffee in the kitchen, the newspaper rustling on the porch, and sometimes a walk down to the bakery. But it was on one of those ordinary mornings that something happened which I never expected. I was at the bakery buying bread and a bottle of milk when my eyes caught sight of a book on display, its cover turned outward, the story of an anonymous father. My book right there in the very town where I had spent my whole life. It wasn't some big bookstore in a mall or a grand shop. No, it was Mr. Whitaker's bakery, the same place I had been buying bread since my children were little. I stood frozen, the loaf still in my hand, staring at it as though I were seeing a ghost. At that moment, a man I knew only by face, Mr. Harlan, stepped up beside me. He smiled and said, "Wonderful story, isn't it, Samuel? Have you heard of this book?" I just nodded. He went on, "They say it was written by someone from right here in town. You know, I was thinking maybe it could be you." He chuckled and walked away. I forced a laugh too, but inside I wanted to cry. Slowly I walked back home, my mind racing. The rest of that day I could not find peace, because even though I had chosen to remain anonymous, a part of me longed to be recognized. Not for fame, not for money, but for something far more simple, to hear one of my children say, "Dad, I read your story. I understand now. That was all I wished for. Nothing more." That same week, something happened I will never forget. One evening at home, I pulled down an old box from the top of the wardrobe. It was just a plain cardboard box, worn out, stuffed with yellowed papers, old bills, receipts, and faded photographs. While digging through, I found a folded piece of paper, a letter written in the shaky handwriting of a child. I opened it carefully. It was from my middle son, written when he was about 10 years old. The letter said, "Dad, thank you for everything. One day, I'll give you a really big house. I love you." As I read, I couldn't stop the tears. The letter was already marked with stains from years ago, tears that had dried long ago, and now I was wetting it again with my own. Sometimes we spend our whole lives waiting for grand moments, recognition, applause, some kind of tribute. But in the end, what truly stays are the small things. A note, a forgotten letter, a memory hidden away in a box. I sat there on the floor, holding that little piece of paper, letting the memories flood back. Sleepless nights watching over them when they were sick. Simple meals of rice and beans, always cooked with care. Days when I came home from school already exhausted, yet still sat with each child to help with their homework. And to think, today, not even a phone call on my birthday. That night, after a long time, I made a decision to do something different. I placed the letter inside a fresh envelope and set it on the kitchen table, the spot where I had always left things that mattered. It felt like I had put it in the right place, a quiet reminder to myself that I was not just any father. I had done my part, and now the rest was for them. What I didn't expect was a knock at my door later that same night. It was nearly 9 o'clock, the sky outside dark, and I was already in my pajamas, sitting in the living room with a book in hand. When the doorbell rang, I froze for a moment. Visitors were rare, especially at that hour. I rose slowly, curiosity mixing with unease, and walked toward the door. When I opened it, I found a young woman standing there, a badge pinned to her chest. She introduced herself as someone from the publishing company. With a nervous smile, she said, "Mr. Samuel, I'm sorry for showing up like this, but we truly need to speak with you in person." For a moment, I was speechless. She quickly went on, "It's about your book. You will hardly believe what has happened." My heart was already pounding, but I managed to step aside and let her in. When she crossed the threshold, I suddenly realized how long it had been since anyone had sat in that kitchen for a real conversation. She seemed a bit uneasy, glancing around as though not sure what to do with her hands. I pulled out a chair for her, an old habit of mine, and offered her coffee. I always did that, whether people wanted it or not. It was my way of being polite. She accepted, and as I prepared the coffee, she got straight to the point. "Mr. Samuel," she said, You remember the phone interview you gave, right? I gave a cautious nod. She continued, after that, sales of the book rose even more. But something unexpected has happened. A major Sunday television program reached out to us. They want to prepare a special report to uncover who the real author is. They are already investigating, and they've received information that points to you. At that instant, it felt like my heart stopped. I sank slowly into the kitchen chair, wrapping both hands around the hot cup, watching the steam curl upward. Inside me, fear and relief battled one another. For as much as I wanted to remain hidden, there was still a part of me that had always longed for recognition. I had dreamed quietly of my story being known. But I wanted it on my own terms, in my own way, in my own time. She looked at me with a serious face and said, "You have to decide now. Do you want to admit fully that you are the author, or should the publisher continue to protect your identity until the end? Either way, with or without your approval, people will eventually discover the truth." Her words echoed in the kitchen, and I stayed silent. I didn't answer right away. My thoughts went straight to my children, 7 of them living their separate lives, sharing posts online, writing comments about how the book reminded them of their own father, without realizing it really was their father's story. That night, after the young woman left, I felt something unusual inside me, the urge to leave the house. I was never one to go out much, always keeping to myself, but I needed space to think. I grabbed my old coat and walked to the town square. It was past 10 o'clock, the streets quiet except for a few couples strolling, some people chatting on benches, and the glow of street lights casting soft shadows. I sat on a bench near the gazebo, the same place I once brought my children to play when they were small. Sitting there, a memory struck me, one I hadn't thought about in many years. My second-to-last son, Peter, had once had a bitter fight with me about money. He wanted to start a business and asked for a large sum, but I told him I couldn't give it. I explained that I was growing old, that I needed to keep the little I had for my medicine and to live with dignity. He became furious, so furious that he shouted words that still ache in me even now. "You're only good for getting in the way." I never shared that with anyone. I carried it in silence, and that night, sitting alone in the square, I realized that maybe this book was my quiet answer to him, to all of them, that I was not useless, that my life, my struggles, and my story had meaning. I sat there for over an hour, just thinking. On the walk home, I passed the bookstore street again. The book's cover stared at me from the window. But this time, instead of turning away, I stopped and looked straight at it. Something inside shifted. By the time I returned home, I felt decided. The next morning, as soon as I woke, I picked up my old cell phone, the one with the oversized buttons that I rarely used. I opened the messaging app and searched for each of my children's numbers. Some I wasn't even sure still worked, but I typed anyway. One by one, I sent them the same short message. "Good morning, I need to tell you something. That book story is mine." Nothing more. No long explanations, no excuses, just the truth. After sending it, I switched off the phone and stepped outside to sweep the yard, because sometimes the only way to keep from overthinking is to keep your hands busy. The rest of that day, I won't hide it, I was filled with a nervousness I hadn't felt in years. I kept glancing at the phone, waiting for some reply, some sign of life. But nothing came. Hours passed in silence until late in the afternoon, the phone finally rang. It was one of them. My hand shook before I even picked it up. When I answered, the first thing I heard was silence, the kind that makes your heart pound because you don't know if it's good or bad. Then came one word, "Dad," and right away I knew the voice. It was Peter. I hadn't heard him in so long, but just the sound carried me back through time. He asked softly, "Dad, is it true?" My voice was low but steady as I replied, "Yes, Peter, the story is mine." On the other end, I heard him take a deep breath, followed by a long pause. It felt like he was swallowing everything at once. His words, his pride, his regrets. Finally, he whispered, "I don't even know what to say." And I told him gently, You don't need to say anything. I only wanted you all to know." Then came silence again, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of distance or rejection. It was a silence of understanding, of something broken being slowly mended. The call lasted less than 2 minutes, yet for me it felt like a locked door had finally opened after years. When I hung up, I sat quietly on the porch, staring at the empty yard, my mind filled with memories of little Peter, his stubborn ways, the silly arguments, the day he first rode his bike without training wheels, while I ran behind him holding on so he wouldn't fall. I remembered too the Father's Day gift he once gave me, a mug with the words "World's Best Dad." That mug had sat proudly on the shelf for years until one day it broke. Looking at nothing, I thought to myself, life is like that mug, forgotten for so long until it either shatters for good or someone remembers to value it again. The very next day, things began to change. One by one, messages appeared. First from William, the oldest, then from Grace, then Daniel. Some wrote, "Dad, forgive me." Others simply said they had read the book and cried. And there I was, sitting with the phone in my hand, reading each message slowly, carefully, not rushing. Every word felt like a brick being placed back into a wall that had crumbled years before. I didn't cry this time. No, I just stayed quiet, my heart warm. I knew not all of them might return. Some might choose silence, holding on to pride. But for me, what I had already received was more than enough. And that same week, something happened I had never expected. Another visit came to my door. One evening, someone knocked on my door, and I was surprised to see who it was. A man I hadn't seen in more than 20 years. David, my old school colleague, a fellow teacher. At first, I almost thought he was just another salesman offering some internet plan, because these days no one really comes by to visit. But no, it was David, wearing his familiar hat and carrying that big smile. The first words out of his mouth were, "Samuel, I knew it was you." No one else could have written that. He had read the book, listened to the interview, and recognized my voice instantly. We sat down in the kitchen, just like we used to long ago. Over steaming cups of coffee, he shared his own story. He too had felt the sting of distance. Children drifting away, people forgetting. We spent hours talking, remembering school days, recalling students who were now grown, and reflecting on how much the world had changed. It was a simple talk, nothing extraordinary, but it was enough to remind me that true friendship still exists. There are still people who do not forget. Later that same night, after he left, I remained in the kitchen alone with only the dim yellow glow of the lamp. A sudden urge came over me to pull down an old box from the top of the wardrobe, a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were piles of yellowed papers, receipts, and old documents. And among them, I found something that struck me deeply. It was a letter, handwritten in a child's uneven script. The moment I saw it, I knew it was Peter's. His handwriting was slightly tilted, the same way it looked when he was first learning to write. I unfolded the paper slowly. It said, "Dad, thank you for everything. One day I will buy you a really big house. I love you." My eyes blurred as I read those words, not from fatigue, but from tears that I couldn't hold back. I sat there with that fragile stained paper in my hands, memories flooding back. The bike rides, the Father's Day mug, even the cruel words spoken years later. Yet this little letter reminded me that the heart never truly forgets. It only falls asleep for a while, and as if fate wanted to prove something to me. That same week, I received another letter, one of the kind people rarely send anymore, a real letter by mail. When I opened it, I found it was from someone I had never met, a reader of my book. They wrote that my story had touched them so much that they picked up the phone and called their father after years of silence. I sat still, reading every word with care, and thought to myself, this is the reason I wrote. Not to be seen, not for fame, but so someone somewhere might remember their father, their mother, those who once gave everything for them. That night, after reading the letter, I didn't go straight to bed. I just sat in the quiet, holding on to the thought that maybe my words had done some good. I walked into the kitchen and took my blue notebook again, but this time it wasn't to continue my story. It was to write something different, something I had kept in my heart for years, a letter to my children. I started like this. Children, I am here. I have always been here. When you want to come, my door is open. You don't need to bring gifts. You don't need to bring excuses. Just come. I left that letter on the table, not because I thought they would ever see it, but for myself to remind me each day that the words I needed to say had already been spoken, and now it was only a matter of waiting. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in a long time, because sometimes the biggest victory in life is not money, not fame, not even seeing your name printed in a book. It is simply being able to lay your head on the pillow and know in your heart that you did the right thing. After I wrote that letter, I believed things would settle down. I told myself that now all I could do was wait, let time take care of the rest. But the truth is, when you live alone for so long, even the smallest change, the slightest sign of something new, shakes everything inside of you. And that is exactly what happened the following week. I was used to the quietness of my days, waking up before sunrise, brewing my coffee, stepping out to check the plants in the yard, or fixing little things around the house. But that Thursday morning, one detail changed everything. I woke as usual before dawn. I love that time, the silence of the world, the faint sound of the first birds beginning to sing. I made my coffee, went to the porch and sat down in the same old wooden chair I always used. That's when I saw it. Stuck on the front gate was a white envelope. I stood up slowly, already feeling something heavy and tight in my chest, and walked toward it. It was a plain envelope, no name, no address. I brought it inside, sat at the kitchen table, slipped on my glasses, and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few words written on it. Dad, I was here, but I didn't have the courage to knock. That was all. But those few words were enough to fill my chest with both pain and warmth for the entire day. I couldn't stop asking myself which of my 7 children had come. Was it Peter? Was it William? I didn't know, and maybe it didn't matter. The important thing was that at dawn, in that silence, one of them had stopped by my door. One of them had remembered, and that same evening, the phone rang again. It was the young woman from the publisher. She said that because of the success of the book, they were planning an event in the neighboring town, a literary fair. There they would honor the anonymous father and invite readers to join in a circle of conversation. She explained that it would be a wonderful chance, that many people were waiting to meet me, and asked if I would attend. At first, I won't lie, I hesitated. I kept asking myself if it was worth showing myself this way, after all these years. But after everything that had happened, especially that envelope left on my gate, I felt maybe the moment had finally arrived. So I told her, yes, I'll go, but only if it's on my terms. She asked what I meant, and I said no stage, no spotlight, no microphone. I just want a simple table, the way I always sit in my kitchen. I want to talk face to face, eye to eye, without barriers. She thought for a second, then agreed. The following week, I prepared myself. I wore my best shirt, the pale blue one I had kept for my children's graduations. I combed my hair carefully, even went to the barber for a trim, and then I left. I reached early as I always did. The neighboring town was bigger, noisier, and to be honest, I felt a little lost among so many unfamiliar faces. But when I finally got to the venue, an old school that had been turned into a cultural center, they handed me a badge with my full name printed on it, Samuel Carter. Seeing that name written out so clearly, I understood that there was no reason to hide anymore. When the meeting began, people surrounded me with kindness. Many came forward to hug me. They were strangers, faces I had never seen before, but from the way they spoke, it felt like they had known me for years. Each one carried a story of their own. One elderly woman came close and whispered, "Mr. Samuel, my father passed away 2 years ago, and I never found the courage to ask his forgiveness. But after reading your story, I finally wrote him a letter. Her words touched me so deeply that I couldn't even answer at first. I just held her hand and listened. That was all I needed. The truth in those voices, the proof that my story had reached beyond myself. And then came the moment that shook me most. The event was nearly finished, and I was standing up to leave when I heard it, a voice from the back of the hall. "Dad." My whole body froze. My heart stopped beating for a moment. I turned slowly, and there he was, Peter, standing in the crowd with tears streaming from his eyes. Beside him were two of my other children. They hadn't come for the book, not just for the event. They had come for me. Right there, I knew something had ended, or maybe something had begun again. Not in the way films show with grand endings, but in the real way life works, slowly, quietly, with long silences and tearful eyes. No big speeches, no rehearsed words, just their presence. I stretched out my hand without speaking, and they walked toward me. That embrace was long, endless, as if it was mending years of distance. And in that hug I understood there was no need for any more words. The silence said everything. After that embrace at the literary fair, I truly believed my heart would finally rest. It felt as if the heavy weight I had carried for years had melted right there in the middle of those people, between the tables, in that circle of stories, without needing speeches, without needing perfect words or prepared apologies. But life doesn't really end chapters the way we wish. It isn't like finishing a book, closing the cover and placing it neatly back on a shelf. No, it doesn't work that way. When I returned home that night, still wearing my light blue shirt, still carrying on my coat the faint perfume of strangers who had hugged me, the house greeted me in its usual silence. The yellow lamp in the kitchen glowed the same, and the old wall clock ticked its steady rhythm, showing 9 o'clock as if nothing had changed. I walked in slowly, hung up my coat, let my hand slide across the smooth wooden table as though checking if it was still real, still mine. I sat down, both palms open on the table, staring into the emptiness and asking myself quietly, will anything truly change now? Because no matter how much my children had appeared at that fair, no matter how warm that hug had been, the truth was clear: our real talk had not yet taken place. I wasn't fooling myself. Healing doesn't come with just one gesture, just one appearance. To repair the cracks of so many years, we would need to sit face to face, speak the words that had been buried deep, face the truths we often run from, but eventually must confront. 2 days later, that moment came. I was in the garden, tending to the plants, when the bell rang. This time it wasn't the publisher, nor the mailman. It was Peter, alone. He wore a plain t-shirt, a cap pulled low on his head, and there was something different about his face. It wasn't hard or bitter like before. It was softer, almost peaceful. He pushed the gate open, stepped inside, and asked gently, "Dad, can I come in?" I nodded, moved aside, and let him enter. He sat down in the kitchen, right in the same chair where the young woman from the publisher had sat weeks earlier. I didn't rush into words. Instead, I followed my old habit. I brewed coffee, placed it in front of him, and stayed quiet. Sometimes silence opens the door for truth better than speeches do. Peter stirred the coffee with his spoon for a while before finally speaking. "I read the whole book twice," he said. His voice wasn't like the quick, nervous tone from the phone call, nor the angry voice I remembered from his younger years. It was steadier, calmer, carrying weight, but also softness. He paused, took a breath, then continued. "At first I was angry. When I realized it was you, I couldn't understand. Why didn't you tell us earlier? Why did you write it for strangers to read instead of telling us directly?" I looked at him carefully, drew a deep breath, and replied with all the calmness in my heart, "Because, Peter, it was the only way you would really listen." He stayed quiet. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just kept stirring his coffee until he finally said, "I understand. Now I truly understand." And at that moment, for the first time in so many years, I felt the conversation I had always longed for was finally taking place. We spoke for more than an hour, going back over old memories, touching on recent things and opening wounds that had been left buried for too long. Peter told me that after his mother passed away, he carried with him a strange sense of abandonment, even though he knew I was the one who remained, the one who cared for them. But children don't reason with logic, children just feel, and the feelings once planted stay. So we sat there, unfolding each matter slowly, step by step, without any rush. When it was time for him to leave, Peter stood up, fixed his cap, and looked at me with hesitation. "Dad, I want to ask you something," he said. I nodded, waiting. He continued, "Teach my kids to write, the same way you taught us." My eyes grew wet at those words, because to me it was more than a request, it was almost forgiveness. I gave him a small smile and replied, "Of course, Peter, any time you want." He walked out shortly after, and I remained there in the kitchen, the smell of coffee still hanging in the air. I thought about how life always finds a way of coming full circle, how we sometimes need to go through so many winding paths and sharp turns just to return to where we began. Later that same afternoon, the phone rang. It was the publisher. They wanted to release a new edition of the book, this time with my real name, Samuel Carter, printed on the cover. I stared at the phone for a while before answering. I thought about everything that had unfolded until that day, then said, "All right, but only if the title stays the same, The Story of an Anonymous Father." Because even with my name there, I knew nothing about the essence had changed. At heart, I was still that father who only wished to be heard. Afterward, I sat out on the porch again with my blue notebook on my lap. But this time, I wasn't writing for myself. I was writing for them, for my grandchildren. A fresh story, a new beginning. That talk with Peter shifted my routine in ways I never imagined it could change anymore. It wasn't dramatic. There were no celebrations, no grand speeches in public squares. It was quiet, simple, yet deep. The very next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I was already awake, preparing coffee. But this time, it wasn't only for me. I heard footsteps in the yard, and when I opened the kitchen door, there he was again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. He came with his eldest son, my grandson, a boy I hardly knew. A tall young man, quiet and hesitant, with the look of someone stepping into unfamiliar ground. Peter walked in, removed his cap, and greeted me naturally, as if we had been doing this all our lives. Then he said, "Dad, remember what I mentioned yesterday? I brought him." I gave a small smile and replied softly, "Well then, come in, let's sit together." That morning, I found myself once again at the old kitchen table, this time teaching my grandson to write, just as I had once taught his father and uncles when they were little. I laid out a piece of paper, handed him a pen, and guided his hand on how to hold it properly. I showed him the simplest of words, the first strokes of letters, the foundation of everything. And in that moment, through that simple act, I realized life was offering me another chance. We grow old thinking we've already given all that we had to give, yet deep inside there is always something more waiting to be shared. At 78, there I was, passing on what I had learned, leaving a mark beyond myself. But what touched me the most was not just that moment of teaching. After the writing lesson, after the coffee had been poured, when Peter was about to leave, he turned to me and said quietly, "Dad, I know we can't change the past, but if you're willing, maybe we could start coming more often." I didn't answer right away. I only nodded. But inside, I felt something stir, something I hadn't felt for years. Hope. In the days that followed, that hope began to grow. Slowly, one by one, the others started coming too. Grace arrived with her husband. Then William showed up on his own. It wasn't every day, not even every week, but it was more than I had ever dared to expect. Each visit began with that same awkward air, long pauses, careful words, smiles that seemed unsure. But little by little, those walls began to crack. The silences grew shorter, the conversations more natural, as if life had pressed pause years ago and was now finally letting the story play again. And then one afternoon, while I was in the yard tending to my plants, something happened that I never thought I would experience again. A package arrived from the publisher. It was large and heavy. I carried it inside, opened it slowly, and found inside the new edition of my book. A hardcover, beautifully bound, with my name, Samuel Carter, printed clearly beneath the title. I stood there frozen for a while, running my hand across the cover, feeling the texture of the paper, the weight of the story in my palms. My eyes grew wet, not because of the book itself, but because of what it symbolized. Me, an old retired teacher who had spent a lifetime raising 7 children alone, who had carried the silence of years, was now holding proof that my story mattered, that it had been heard, remembered, and given a place. That day, I decided to do something special. I took 2 copies of that book, wrote a personal dedication inside each, placed them carefully into a gift bag, and set out for the neighboring town. I took the bus, the same way I used to do many years ago. Sitting by the window, I watched the familiar streets pass by, though so much had changed since the days when I rode that bus daily. When I got off downtown, I walked slowly, step by step, until I reached the school where I had spent so much of my life teaching. Walking through that gate felt like stepping into another time. I greeted the secretary politely and asked if I could see the principal. He was a young man I had never met before, polite and respectful, with the energy of someone just beginning his journey. He welcomed me into his office, offered me coffee, and we sat down. I handed him the 2 books and said gently, "I would like the school library to keep these copies. I want the children here to know that even in a small town, someone can have their story told." He smiled warmly, shook my hand firmly, and thanked me with true sincerity. It was in that moment that I fully realized my story was no longer only mine. It belonged to others now, to anyone who might one day open those pages. I returned home with a lighter heart, but deep inside there was still an emptiness, a small space that ached quietly. I had seen most of my children again, almost all, but one was still missing, the youngest, Joseph. He was the only one who had given no sign of life since everything began. That troubled me more than I could admit, because Joseph had once been the closest to me when he was little. He was the one who helped me water the plants, who walked beside me to school, who often stayed quiet at my side without needing words. But when he grew older, he moved far away, and since then, silence had settled between us. It was on a Sunday night, just as I was preparing to go to bed, that my phone rang. The screen showed an unknown number. At first I almost ignored it. I was tired, but something made me answer. And then from the other end I heard that voice. "Dad." My heart stopped for a moment. It was Joseph. My chest tightened, and for a few seconds I couldn't speak. Finally I managed. "Joseph, it's so good to hear your voice." He was silent for a moment, breathing heavily as if holding back emotions. Then he said, "Dad, I read the whole book. I know I was late. I was angry. But now..." That phone call became the longest and deepest conversation I had shared with one of my children since everything had begun. We spoke for more than half an hour. He told me about his life, where he was living, his work, and even about my grandchildren I hadn't even known existed. At the end, he admitted, "I really want to come see you, Dad, but I don't know if I have the courage." I answered softly, "Joseph, courage is not for those who feel ready. It's for those who come even while they are afraid. Whenever you wish, my door is open." That night, after hanging up, I sat quietly on the porch, looking up at the wide, dark sky filled with stars. And as I stared at them, I couldn't help but remember my youth, the many nights I had sat under that same sky, listening to the soft breathing of my little boys sleeping inside the house, dreaming of what their futures might become. Now, after so many years, I understood the future had already arrived. And even with all the distance, even with the silence of decades, one thing had never changed: the bond of a father and his children. My place would always be here, with the door open, waiting. And as I sat there that night, looking up at the wide sky, the blue notebook resting on my lap and the new book beside me, I finally understood something. Not every story ends the way we imagine. Sometimes it doesn't end at all. It simply continues, takes a pause, and then finds its breath again. After that call with Joseph, I spent several days in a state that is hard to describe. It wasn't exactly sadness, and it wasn't the sharp edge of anxiety either. It was more like a quiet waiting, the kind of peace a person feels after doing all they could, now just watching, hoping, allowing time to do its work. I kept to my routine, watering the plants, cleaning the house, writing in the blue notebook. But each time the phone rang or footsteps echoed faintly in the street, my heart jumped like a bird startled in its nest. And then on a grey afternoon filled with rain, it finally happened. The air smelled of wet earth, and the cold wind moved through the yard as I sat on the porch, watching drops break against the cement floor. Suddenly, the old gate creaked open, very slowly. I rose from my chair, not rushing, almost as if I already knew. And there he was, Joseph. A grey coat soaked from the rain clung to him, his face tired, unshaven, marked by the years. Yet beneath all that, I saw the same boy who once held my hand on the way to school. He didn't speak at first. He just stood still at the entrance, rainwater dripping from his sleeves. I didn't speak either. Instead, I simply raised my hand and opened the door wider, giving him space to step in. He walked inside with slow, heavy steps, and the house seemed quieter than ever, only the steady rain outside and his boots on the kitchen floor breaking the silence. I pulled out a chair. He sat, removed his coat, rubbed his face with both hands as if trying to gather strength, and finally he was the one to start. "Dad," he said softly. I almost didn't come. I looked at him without interrupting, waiting. His voice shook as he continued. "I spent weeks thinking maybe it was already too late. But last night, I dreamed of Mom." The moment he said that, my eyes filled instantly with tears. It had been so many years since anyone spoke her name aloud, and hearing it from Joseph, my youngest, cut straight to the deepest part of me. He went on. "In the dream, she told me to come. She said not to let this pass. We stayed there for a long while, saying nothing, just sipping hot coffee together, the steam rising between us as the rain kept falling outside. And in that silence, I realized something powerful. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need fancy words or rehearsed speeches. His presence alone was enough. And little by little, he began to share more about his life, his children, his work, the joys he carried, and the struggles he faced. Each word felt like a bridge being rebuilt, one plank at a time. I listened to everything without rushing, holding on to every detail like someone recovering pieces of a forgotten past. Joseph asked me about his brothers and sister, about the book fair, about how people had reacted to my story. I answered each question calmly, and he just nodded, a quiet smile appearing on his lips. With a little awkward laugh, he said, "You always knew how to surprise us, didn't you?" That night was unlike all the nights I had lived for so long. He didn't leave early. Instead, I prepared the small room in the back for him to sleep, something I hadn't done for years. The whole night I kept waking up, listening carefully for the sound of his breathing, making sure he was truly there in the house. Each time I heard it, I returned to bed with a lighter heart. The next morning, the house already felt different. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. But there was also something else, the sound of footsteps moving around, doors opening and closing, the tap running. When I came into the kitchen, Joseph was already standing by the stove, brewing coffee for me. I smiled to myself because never in my life had I seen one of my children awake before me, taking care of the house. We sat together, sharing coffee and speaking about ordinary things, television, football, little stories from the newspaper. And I thought, this is it. This is what I waited for. I didn't need applause, no ceremonies, no grand recognition. These small, simple moments were enough. Before leaving later that morning, Joseph surprised me once again. He walked to the bookshelf, picked up a copy of my book, opened it to the first page, and said, "Dad, write something for me, just like you used to when you taught us to read." My hands shook slightly as I held the pen, but I wrote slowly and carefully. "Joseph, Never forget there is always time to begin again. With love, your father. He read it quietly, closed the book with care, tucked it under his arm, and gave me a long, unhurried hug. Not a quick gesture, but a true embrace that carried all the words left unsaid. After he left, I stood by the gate for a long time, looking at the empty street, the fallen leaves damp from the rain, and breathing in the fresh air. And it was there, in that stillness, that I understood something I had never fully grasped until that moment. We spend so much of life waiting for thanks, waiting for recognition, waiting for our children to repay what we once gave them. But in the end, what truly matters is not their words or actions, it is the quiet certainty that no matter how much time has passed, no matter how much silence has stood between us, they still know how to find their way back home. With that thought warming me, I turned and walked slowly back into the kitchen. I sat in my usual chair, opened the blue notebook and wrote once again, but this time the words were not meant for me, nor for my children. It was just a simple record, a single line. Today all my children know where I am, and that is enough. After so much, life returned to being calm, but not with the same heavy silence as before. Now, every so often, the chairs in the kitchen were filled again. The coffee cups piled up quicker, the table was no longer spotless, and the floor carried the marks of footsteps. Each visit from a child or grandchild brought a kind of beautiful disorder, the kind of mess you ache for when it's missing. My days stayed simple. I still rose early, checked on the plants and leafed through the blue notebook. But something inside me had changed. It was like living with the quiet peace of knowing I had already done my part, and nothing was left undone. Time itself seemed to move differently. The days passed faster, or perhaps I simply noticed them more. Calls began to come, not only from my children, but from schools, churches, even radio stations. Some wanted me to speak, others dreamed of turning my book into a film, a documentary, one of those modern things I never fully understood. But my answer was always the same. My place is here, in my kitchen, with my coffee and my chair. And maybe because of that, people who came to me always said they felt at home, because here nothing was decorated or exaggerated. Everything remained simple, everything remained real. Then came a special afternoon I will never forget. For the first time since my eldest's wedding many years ago, all 7 of them arrived together. They didn't come dressed alike, they hadn't planned anything, but seeing them all standing at my door made my heart swell in the best possible way. They spread through the house, the kitchen, the living room, the porch, sitting on chairs on the floor, wherever they could. The rooms filled with mixed voices, with laughter, with the smell of food cooking in a large pot. For a moment the house felt alive again, as though time had folded back and given me what I thought was gone forever. It was during that gathering that something symbolic happened. Grace, my middle daughter, carried in a simple wooden frame, light in color. Inside was the very first page of my blue notebook, scanned carefully, showing my crooked handwriting. Once upon a time, there was a man who raised 7 children alone. She placed it in the kitchen and said softly, "Dad, so this always stays here, so no one forgets." I stood looking at it with my hands tucked in my pockets, saying little, but feeling a wave of gratitude I could not describe. Because sometimes recognition does not arrive in grand speeches, it hides in small, quiet gestures like this. That night, after everyone had gone and the rooms were still again, I found myself alone once more. But it was a different kind of alone. It was no longer the painful loneliness I once carried. Now it was a softer kind of solitude, the peaceful silence of someone who has already lived through a full house and can finally sit in the quiet without sadness. I stayed on the porch that night, watching the dark yard, listening to the steady sound of crickets, and my mind wandered through everything I had lived. Life has a way of circling back, I thought. Stories end, then begin again. We walk through long, winding paths, only to discover that the true treasures were always near us, waiting quietly. My eyes drifted to the frame hanging in the kitchen with those words from my old notebook, and I understood something clearly. That book was never written only for me, nor only for my children. It was for anyone who had ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or made to believe they had no value, because at some point we all feel that way. And when that moment comes, we all need a voice that whispers, "You are not alone." As the months passed, I noticed I was writing less in the blue notebook, not because I had lost the will, but because the most important things had already been said. My story no longer lived just between sheets of paper. It breathed in the gatherings, in the hugs that lasted longer than words, in the quiet visits that warmed the kitchen, in the cups of coffee shared without hurry. And that, I realized, was more than enough. Perhaps this is the true victory in life. Not money, not a name printed on a cover, not recognition or applause, but the simple truth that even after so many twists, so many silences, and so many locked doors, things can fall back into place, people can find their way to each other again, and even if scars remain, even if words left unsaid still weigh, the essentials stay unbroken. Family is still family. Love is still love. If you have listened to me until here, I thank you. And I also thank the Father's Advice channel for giving me this chance to tell my story and keep this space alive. Please subscribe and share this video, because every day a new story is told, and maybe, just maybe, one of them will reflect your own. Don't forget to write a comment below and let us know from which city you are watching, because in the end, this is the greatest victory of all. Not wealth, not fame, not grand achievements, but the quiet certainty that after all the detours, the silences, and the separations, people can return to each other. And though it may not be perfect, though old pains may still exist, the essentials remain unshaken. Family is family, and love is always love. She brought with her a small wooden frame, light in color, nothing fancy, but filled with meaning. Inside was the scanned first page of my blue notebook, showing my uneven handwriting. Once upon a time, there was a man who raised 7 children alone. She hung it carefully on the kitchen wall and said softly, "Dad, this is so it stays here, where no one will forget." I just stood there, hands tucked in my pockets, saying little, but inside me was a gratitude so deep it was hard to explain. Recognition doesn't always arrive through applause or speeches. Often it comes in these quiet, tender gestures that carry more weight than any words. The weeks after that felt different than any I had lived in years. My phone began ringing more often, not with silence but with the voices of my children. "Dad, do you need anything from the store? Dad, I'm baking your favorite pie this weekend. Can I bring it over?" Ordinary things, simple words, but they filled spaces that had been empty far too long. Joseph began visiting with his children every other Sunday. William would stop by after work, just to share a quick coffee before heading home. Grace and her husband invited me to their table for dinner. Slowly, piece by piece, bridges were being built again. Not all at once, not perfectly, but strong enough to carry us forward. What touched me most was how the grandchildren embraced me. These children who hardly knew me, who had only heard fragments of who their grandfather was, now sat at my kitchen table, learning to write letters, or followed me into the yard to water the plants. They carried no weight of old hurts, no burden of silence. To them I was simply Grandpa Samuel, the man with stories, the man who wrote a book. Their laughter filled the house in ways that healed me more than they could know. As months passed, I found myself writing less in the blue notebook. Not because I no longer cared, but because I felt I had already spoken what mattered most. My story no longer belonged only to the pages. It was alive now in the sound of voices echoing through the house, in the shuffle of shoes across the porch, in the coffee cups left unwashed in the sink. Life itself had become the continuation of the book. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived from Oregon. A woman wrote that her father had passed before she had the chance to make peace with him. She said my story gave her permission to forgive herself. "We can't always repair what is broken," she wrote, "but we can learn to live with the cracks." I read her words slowly, folded the letter with care, and placed it inside the blue notebook. It was another piece of proof that this story was no longer just mine. On my 80th birthday, a date that in past years had slipped by unnoticed, my children prepared a small celebration in the backyard. Nothing extravagant, just family, a homemade cake, laughter, and a few kind neighbors gathered around. And in that simple evening, I felt richer than I had ever felt in my entire life. As the soft evening light slipped through the trees and my grandchildren ran across the lawn chasing fireflies, I let my eyes rest on the faces of my children. They were no longer the little ones from the old photograph I once kept in a drawer. They were grown now, carrying their own wrinkles, their own stories, their own battles. Yet here they were, all together again, under the same roof of love that had once felt broken. Peter came closer, holding a small package. "From all of us, Dad," he said, placing it gently in my hands. I unwrapped it slowly, almost afraid of what I might find. Inside was a new notebook, bound in deep blue leather, my name stamped in shining gold across the cover. I opened it carefully, and on the very first page, I saw words written by all 7 of my children. For the stories yet to come, for the wisdom yet to be shared, for the father who never gave up waiting. I traced their handwriting with my fingers, each script different, each one carrying its own weight of love, and inside me something felt whole. Not because life was perfect. It wasn't. There were still pauses in conversation, still moments when the past tried to sneak in. But I understood something at last. Family isn't about perfection. It is about staying, about returning, about being there even after pain. As the night came to a close and they prepared to leave, each child hugged me longer than usual. "See you Sunday, Dad," they said one after the other. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a promise. Later, when the house was quiet again, I sat in the kitchen. Outside the crickets sang, and inside the walls still carried the echo of laughter. I placed the new blue notebook on the table and held it for a long while, feeling its weight, its promise. Finally, I picked up my pen and wrote one simple line. "Once upon a time, there was a father who lost his children and then found them again." I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and went to bed with a peace I hadn't known in years. Morning would bring its own miracles. Coffee on the porch, maybe a call from one of my children, maybe a visit from a grandchild. Small joys, ordinary moments, the kind of things that truly make a life. And that, my friends, is the real ending of my story. Not with loud celebrations or dramatic endings, but with quiet connections, with open doors, with a family that found its way home. If you have listened this far, thank you. And I want to thank the Father's Advice channel for allowing me to share my journey. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share it with someone who may need to hear it. Every day there's a new story here, and maybe one will feel like your own. Don't forget to comment below and tell us which city you're watching from, because sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen to each other's stories. They remind us of a simple truth: we are never truly alone.